we are conceiving of Indigenous media as not something that is just what we see on the screen, we really need to look at the context of production to understand it as a practice, as a form of social practice.
There are these narratives that are assumed about certain types of stories. These things can go different ways, the desire for resolution or for challenge and deficit in different genres.
Well, hi, I'm Carmen Cray. I'm associate professor in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University. I'm also on my father's side, Stalo from Chiam First Nation, which is in southern British Columbia. I'm just starting us off by way of introduction. I'm also here with Willie Lempert, and we'll allow him to introduce himself as we launch into discussion of our both pretty recently published books on Indigenous media that were published by the University of Minnesota. So I'll let you take it away, Willie.
Thanks, Carmen. I'm really thrilled to connect with you about our books today. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. I've been looking forward to this for a long time to connect our books to the broader Canadian and Australian Indigenous media contexts.
Yeah, I think this will be a really interesting conversation because my area of specialty really focuses much more on North America, though the global dimensions of Indigenous media is like undeniable and absolutely a part of the Indigenous media histories that I know we're going to dig into a little bit today, but I'm really excited to hear from you and about your experience in, is it appropriate to call it like Aboriginal media or is it Indigenous media more recently? That seems to be a more recent term than in different histories of Indigenous medias around the world.
I mean, that's a great question. So, the distinction of Indigenous in Australia at a sort of technical level is that it includes Torres Strait Islanders, whereas Aboriginal is very specifically to the continent itself. But you're absolutely right. It also speaks to, even when considering the continent, Indigenous, and then more recently, First Nations. As my understanding is, a nod towards Canada's sovereignty movements has been something that's more recently been utilized to think about nationhood itself. So there's absolutely varying elements of why those terms are used, and Indigenous is increasingly an important way of describing the media, even just sort of on the mainland.
I know I'm going to come back to this question, but maybe what we should do first is talk about what we're going to talk about, which are our books. Just by way of general overview, my book is called Producing Sovereignty, The Rise of Indigenous Media in Canada. So it looks at the Indigenous media history from the 1990s onward. And that time frame was primarily established by me observing that Indigenous media really exploded as of 1990 onward in Canada. My impetus for the research really had to do with how did this happen? Like, why is 1990 onward? Why does it rise exponentially and not just in one area or one format, but across all available formats, film, television, video, digital media, all across Canada during that era, which it has continued to develop since. So that was, in a nutshell, that's what my book is about. Maybe I'll let you go, Willie.
Yeah, and just as a transition, I really loved engaging deeply with your book, Producing Sovereignty. I think it's vital on so many levels. I learned a lot about the nuances of Canadian Indigenous media, where I'd sort of understood bits and pieces, but I think your book does a really fantastic job of bringing together the big picture of the various elements and, of course, the institutions that are engaged. And that would have, been more than enough, but I think you also do a great job of grounding the sort of big picture view within particular filmmakers and films and crucial issues. And I especially appreciate how you highlight media and filmmakers that have received less attention while still keeping a sense of the big picture and the major movements. So, very excited to talk about your book and to say a little bit about my book that was published in June of this year, also through Minnesota. It's called Dreaming Down the Track: Awakenings in Aboriginal Cinema. It's based on 32 months of field work in Northwestern Australia, where I was embedded within Indigenous production teams. I collaborated on dozens of films. And the book follows a subset of these projects in and around the Balgo Aboriginal community in the Great Sandy Desert. And throughout this project, I describe how the process of cinematic envisioning transforms how creators imagine and actualize Aboriginal futures during apocalyptic times. And so this book is sort of a subset of the films I focused on in my fieldwork and my dissertation, specifically around the film career of Kukucha elder Mark Moora. In his sort of entire film arc, where I got to know him in the last decade or so of his life, projects around Balgo, in his project Tjawa Tjawa, which I'll talk a little bit about. It went to the Sydney Film Festival and ImagiNATIVE, and really, I was chronicling in this book how he felt deeper into this idea that films were a very important way of actualizing sovereign community futures on his country for his family. And so I'm really thinking about the films in terms of their total social lives throughout the entire sort of span of the process. I talk about this idea of a broader visibility paradox around the flourishing sphere of Indigenous Australian media, which I think connects to your discussion about Canada, particularly in the 90s, which I'm excited to talk about. So there's that. And at the same time, there's these escalating state policies of dispossession and defunding. And it's also in the context of a recent national referendum that was voted down, the first negotiations to establish treaties between Aboriginal nations and the Australian state. And so it really aims to understand the stakes of Aboriginal and settler state relations in this current context through a sort of close attention to specific media projects.
Great. So I guess there's so many parallels between our projects, historically, socially, politically, in terms of not just like state law and policy, but Indigenous nationalism, sovereignty, and the role of media within these social movements and political debates. We can start really broadly. We've both been teaching now at universities and elsewhere for the better part of a decade anyway. And I think one of the first questions a lot of people has is when we talk about Indigenous media, what are we talking about? Because it's not always going to be the same thing, and those definitions can shift and change over time. In my experience, it's one of the most taken for granted questions, but it's actually a really important one. Sometimes I feel like I get asked, what's Indigenous media? And what people were really asking is like, what makes Indigenous media different from other media? And that kind of question, framed with certain kinds of expectations, is almost asking, what are the features, aesthetic and otherwise, that I can define that describe Indigenous media? And so it's almost like a category of descriptions that feels a little essentialist to me, when people are looking for, oh, I can describe it in this way and it has these features and it looks this way and its politics are this way. And I find that troubling. And, I think a lot of other people have challenged that way of thinking, the cultural essentialist perspective. So, how do you, Willie, answer this question?
I'm so glad you started with this. Often, this sort of fundamental questions are very deep, and they're questions that animate the entire space, and how people are thinking about things very sort of self reflexively. So I'll start with the relatively concise answer based on sort of my experience in Northwestern Australia and how people in the field, in my field work, described what Indigenous media was. It was understood as having three components, and I'll sort of elaborate on this, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts on how this plays out in Canada and in your work as well. But the three components were: one, media produced by an Indigenous run organization. That was really important. With an Indigenous person in the lead creative role, and there's a lot of layers to what that means, and with a mostly Indigenous crew. And so this relates also to the particular context of indigeneity in Australia and the inclusion of non Indigenous media crew, as well as how media qualities around production values and genre are considered and negotiated. One aspect that comes up a lot And I'll use the term white fella. It's a very common, not necessarily judgmental word that's used in Aboriginal community media to mean usually a European Australian, but it can also be a broader term of someone who's not from the community or from away. And there's a long and ongoing discussion in the Indigenous Australian sphere about how to consider the boundaries of who should be included in an Indigenous project. So, one of the discussions that happens is on the one hand, there's this kind of essentialist purity politics about Aboriginal media. And I can't even think of another genre that's similarly framed around a group of people that has to face the sort of standard that a single non member can be perceived as polluting a film project. And people would often talk about the frustration of sort of not being allowed to have help without being questioned about the sort of purity of the project. So that relates to enduring colonial conceptions of Aboriginal people as radically other, and particularly in Australia, imagined living temporally in the past as quote unquote the world's oldest continuing societies, and then spatially in the desert outback away. So this is one of the areas in which strong Indigenous organizations and creative leads and projects make really crucial and individual decisions based on deep experience. There's a lot of stories of white fellas who've been considered to be really productive and core members of crews, and a lot of stories of white fellas who've derailed entire projects. And in the book, I have a chapter that talks about a model for white fella roles and clear boundaries called Fires, Tires, and Paper. And this focuses on the importance of Indigenous control over vision, materials, and funding, with also white fellas often facilitating bureaucratic barriers toward these specific ends, if specifically invited to do so. So there's that piece of who is involved in the film and the sort of purity politics involved. There's another element that has to do with Indigenous community membership in Australia as compared to Canada and the United States. So since there are not yet any treaties in Australia, community and tribal membership is not based on blood quantum requirements, and there's a different sort of set of economic stakes of official belonging. And so membership is based on the three elements of established descent, self identification, and community recognition based on lived relationships with the community. So the topics of films emerge from those relationships with family and tend to organically develop from stories of family members on crews and in organizations. So there's that element too that is a little bit different in Australia than some other settler state contexts. And then, briefly, there's other subtle issues around media qualities that connect to the cultural essentialist aspect of your question, which I think is so important. And I appreciate you bringing that up. People would talk often about Indigenous production value, specifically in workshops, at festivals, based on shared experiences with relations, communities, and country. And Faye Ginsburg, as you talk about in your book, has this idea of embedded aesthetics, in which aesthetics is connected to the social, material dimensions of media and relations. I mean, I was thinking a lot about this in your book with the discussion of cyclical storytelling and not having omniscient narrators. There are these qualities that are sort of emerge based on shared values, but it can slip into the sort of through Navajo Eyes famous project that you also mentioned, in which it becomes quite sort of narrowly defined as a certain type of way of doing things and not others. So the final thing I'll mention is there were often really deep genre discussions at Indigenous television networks about sort of where to place certain programs and how to give awards and what awards meant. And there were a lot of debates about, what falls into the our culture category, or our elders and our language. And these were, negotiated and debated things, but things that were very deeply engaged and understood in incredibly, sophisticated ways. And there's this sort of balance between making sure that there's not pressure to make media that aligns with narrow definitions of culture as only traditional practices and Aboriginal languages. In Australia, this often tends to be about dreaming stories and songlines. And yet at the same time, such projects are seen as really important by a lot of folks in the context of colonial dispossession and aging elders. So that was one tension. And so there's that in the sense that those are really important projects. But there's also simultaneously a really self-conscious focus to not have such constraints. And the projects I was involved with, spanned from music videos, stop motion animation, like comedy, sign language, visual dictionaries, dramas, desert trips, PSAs, commercials. So there was a lot of self-awareness that there's a balancing of tensions around this essentialist danger while also honoring the fact that a lot of traditional culture projects were important to folks and communities.
Probably when I was starting my research, when I started my PhD at the University of California, Los Angeles, in the film and television program, I think there was some confusion between the idea of content and context. So, I had to first clarify along exactly the lines that you were saying, that it's production by an Indigenous creator or creatives. And that definition has gotten clearer even more in Canada since all of the scandals of pretendians in the Indigenous media landscape here, which were in the news very prominently, that really affected the Indigenous media communities here profoundly. I think it's been a deeply troubling and churning kind of time, and it reached into all areas. So I think in those tensions, in those conflicts, there's become an increased clarification of what we mean by Indigenous people. And it's along the lines, that this gets, we have, without diving headfirst into it, the by question has always remained, the core of that question. Do Indigenous people have creative control, direction of the project, whatever that project is? The head of the Indigenous Screen Office, former head, Jesse Wente, he's Anishinaabe, and he has always spoken about Indigenous media as by and for Indigenous people. So the by has gotten increasingly clear as everybody's had to articulate what we mean by by. And that has been, along the lines of, that's been codified in some production contexts as more than 50% ownership of a production company has to be Indigenous in order for them to qualify for funding that has been set aside for Indigenous production, whatever that would look like, often through state funding. And the for, though, aspect of that formulation, I think, has always been very wide open. Like, what do we mean by for? And, that looks like you're describing a lot of things, but it rests within a kind of, I think, as you've described it, an ethical question about, when we think about for, it involves relations with kinds of audiences, viewers. What do we show and not show? Like, it involves these kinds of ethical questions. Now, when I started the project, I just started it really broadly and was like, started with the by as, just to open up as wide a lens on what that means in Canada specifically, because I had to give it some shape. Otherwise, I would just go on and on and on, looking all over. Even North America would have been too much to talk about. So just focusing on the Canadian context, it was like, who's identified as the director, the producer, the lead creative on this project. And then that gave me as kind of a big scope to be able to look at the patterns of production. Like, where are these creatives working? When are they working? What genre? What format? What institutions? So it gave me a good way to develop a kind of like profile of what does this landscape really look like? And so I think the debates around the for part of the formulation are something that the creatives are going to work out what they mean by that, and that's not something I'm going to direct or dictate. But it does get at that Indigenous producers have, values, principles, and ethical orientations that lead them to make different decisions in the production, in the editing, in the, screenings, the whole process of making the media is going to be inflected by different values, and that's ultimately where my research is going to be heading. But really what the book was looking at was like, what does this look like when we take the broadest lens that is reasonable and manageable to see really where are Indigenous creatives working during this really significant time period in Indigenous history in Canada. So I think we're really, in so many ways, fundamentally aligned. So there's been, the questions around the purity of the project, I think, have kind of sort of sorted themselves out. That, yeah, certainly, in my project too, I wasn't necessarily looking only at, if I was following the filmmaker, say, and like looked at their body of work, they were going to have different roles on different productions, and the extent of their creative input and control was always going to be constrained in some way by the context of production, by funding, that sort of thing. But they've made creative decisions that contributed to the production, and I wanted to look at what those were. And sometimes they were really important interventions too. So if they were brought on, say, as a guest director or something like that, I was interested how they negotiated their role in that production and how they made decisions about how they were going to shape the project with their contributions. And a lot of that I found really on the production side of things. So, and I think we really have a lot of that in common, is that we are conceiving of Indigenous media as not something that is just what we see on the screen. We really need to look at the context of production to understand more fully understand it as a practice, as a form of social practice.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I appreciate what you're saying about the fact that people have values of production. And one of the things I was thinking about in my book and in reading yours is that, production values almost go without saying, like that they're just high or low, as in Hollywood production values, but people have different values. And there's sort of cultures and traditions of values, which is very different than the question of the qualities of a genre, which is much more about something frozen in time and can veer into even, the colonial pretty quick. And to your point, I was thinking too about how for at least decades now, people who, Indigenous managers and people running Aboriginal and Indigenous media organizations in Australia, they have a very fine tooth comb and quick gut understandings of non Indigenous people involved. And it's almost impossible for someone to now derail projects. People are so experienced in understanding who will be someone who's interested in facilitating things in a appropriate way, or someone who has got some other baggage coming along. So there's so much sort of top level also agency in very quickly making sure that people who shouldn't be there aren't there. And there's a lot of power in that, and a lot of skill. To this conversation, I wanted to connect to a question that I think relates, which has to do with the importance of, as just one example, nonlinear storytelling in Indigenous media that you have engaged as part of a sort of way into thinking more about kind of cultures of production values and kind of patterns of how people think about telling stories. I really appreciate in your book when you talk about Donna's story, the importance of cyclical storytelling that doesn't provide neat closure. And I thought you mentioned that a few times throughout the book, and it's a really powerful point that it has to do with the fact that these deeper issues are not closed about Indigenous women's, violence against Indigenous women, amidst other issues too. And the importance of sort of humanizing people amidst really difficult topics. And I wonder if you can say something about, how you think about that sort of non-essentializing way of talking about those patterns of storytelling that you noticed in your book and in your fieldwork, perhaps beyond as well.
So you're referring to Donna's Story as a National Film Board of Canada documentary production. For those who don't know, the National Film Board of Canada is Canada's public film agency. So as a national film agency, its job has historically been to, sort of represent Canada to Canadians and the world. That's the sort of catch of its mission. And historically, it's had a really bad track record of depicting Indigenous people in Canada to Canadians. Like I've screened some really to show my students examples, some deeply troubling, films from like the 50s, 60s, that are showing the happy assimilation of Indigenous people into, Canadian society. And this is really marking an era of Canadian national identity that was very problematic for Indigenous people and is just about to, at that era, going to trigger a major sort of uh, Indigenous nationalism movement that is going to carry through into today. But so, as a kind of redress, the National Film Board of Canada, its policy became, well, Indigenous people should represent Indigenous people and concerns. And this became, a really guiding principle. And so their orientation shifted to setting aside funding and programs for Indigenous filmmakers. And the chapter you're referring to in the book is focusing on Doug Cuthand. He is a Cree journalist, documentary filmmaker, editorialist, author. He's just really worn a lot of hats. And I noticed he wasn't really discussed in the literature, which was interesting to me. I'm like, why did people overlook him? So I really made this chapter about focusing on him, and his critical, certainly has an unerring critical perspective, and was very cautious in depicting the focus of the film. Donna Gamble is a Cree woman who's working through addiction, and it's kind of a portrait of a woman who has worked as a sex worker, who has struggled with addiction, and she is transforming her life. She's really found a lot of her health and healing really through connection with her community and her culture. And there's a way where that story could have been plotted along the redemption narrative arc that a lot of documentaries, a lot of films really want to impose on human beings. That there's this sort of, you arise like a phoenix from the ashes, you arise and change your life through this deeply romanticized connection with community. But this documentary is really different in that it's really about the work and complexity of that. Like that's not just a simple thing to do, that there's a lot of trauma within families, and certainly within Donna's, that is there, and a presence, and that they are actively working to heal from. But this is a very deep history that marks Indigenous families. You can't impose this unproblematic narrative. And that was really about creating a portrait of this is a real human person. This is not a abstracted Native woman victim narrative, that really abstracts women into a signifier, like a metaphor for Canada's failures and this, the West's failure for Indigenous people. And rather, it really is about the work of what recovery for addicts really looks like. And in the end, she relapses, and the relapse isn't shown on camera. Donna narrates that to the camera, that she did relapse. And the end is that she has now entered back into the cycle of recovery. So really, it's structured. Doug told me that he really had to fight for that ending with the NFB, because they wanted the hopeful, inspiring ending that Native people often represent for white people, like settler eyes. And he's like, no, this is real. This is a human struggle. And that recovery is not a straight trajectory upwards towards like sobriety. It's a cycle that people are in their entire lives. Relapse is a part of recovery, right? So it's inherently a cycle. And so she's in the cycle, like she's working through a cycle in the film. And I just really appreciated how he really stuck to his like ethical and representational guns there and was like, no, we have to humanize, really humanize and have some integrity towards what recovery actually looks like. If you really want to represent the struggle that many Indigenous people are in, let's be honest about what that struggle looks like and stop romanticizing recovery for anybody, but let alone sort of tokenize her story to like inspire audiences, like to have the quote unquote inspirational story around what real human Indigenous woman who is an inspiration to her community, who is a social worker who does workshops with high schools on sexual health, that she is an inspiration who can relapse, like that doesn't make her any less. That ethical orientation, that's what I think about. What, like, he's intervening at the production level in terms of like really fighting for something that was really crucial to tell that story and to advocate for her, and that he intervened in this kind of genre conventions of the sort of inspirational documentary in order to tell something different. And that was, I think, much more important than sort of tacking a false ending onto that. That would totally misunderstand her and misunderstand what addiction and recovery looks like. So that's kind of like cyclical for me, was kind of like, it's in the context of what was needed to tell that story. But I don't know, like, I think for you, you've talked about like the cyclical aspects of different stories differently. So do you want to talk a bit about why that sticks for you, in terms of your own work?
Yeah, absolutely. And as a quick aside, I really appreciate how you come back to Donna's story toward the end of the book and connect it to TR's, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and the deeper points about reconciliation. While I have it in my mind, like what I was thinking about is how there are these narratives that are assumed about certain types of stories. And there was one that was almost the opposite, but the same, that played out in my field work, where there was a PSA short video that was meant to get kids to go to school. And the film went great. It was a local metal band, had songs. There was a lot of comedy in it. It was picking kids up from the basketball court, taking them to school, and they were happy to go. But the problem was they were happy to be playing basketball. They were happy to be walking around their community and not being at school. And it was basically rejected because the critique is that the kids were too happy not being in school. And it led to sort of a very strange set of conversations. Then they had to make a new one that was sort of morose and down about kids struggling. Um, and so it just makes me think that these things can go different ways, the desire for sort of resolution or for challenge and deficit in different genres. To the point of cyclical storytelling, some stories, like the story of Mark's life that I tell in my book, the life history near where he grew up in a mission out of town, and that was a story that was sort of cyclically told. So he started at the present, kind of went deeper into the past. And so there are these stories that kind of feel like they're cycles in how they're told and in their meanings. And literally things happening again and again, policies and communities closing and reopening, and these waves of colonial oppression that come in and out in different ways. But then at the same time, there is sometimes this over theorization of a radical difference around cyclical time that can make it seem like people don't live in the same reality at all. Or Rifkin's book Temporal Sovereignty, I think, does a nice job of engaging this. What I think is great about diving into particular media projects as they unfold and the people who are making them is you can really parse out, to your point, about the assumptions and the expectations that people are pushing against, but also the way in which things are directed not by some sort of deeper fundamental quality, but by the topic and the context and the relations involved. The particularity of projects is really important. Because there were also very linear music videos that were about going somewhere, of course. And I think the specificity becomes really important.
Yeah, that was, I mean, that ultimately, I think, is what the project in my book was about. There are parallels around demands for Indigenous sovereignty, for that foment like Indigenous nationalist movements. There are broad historical and social and economic forces at work that contribute to these trajectories that look a lot the same. But my problem is when people start ascribing like kind of sussing out, looking for these kind of essentialist readings of Indigenous media based on broader patterns rather than looking very closely at recognizing that Indigenous nationalisms is not are particular and specific to Indigenous nations, or more abstractly, political entities, however that is being formulated. And so Indigenous nationalisms, in Canada took shape around the rhetoric, the language of nationhood, because it's being articulated within a social and political global order that only recognizes other nations, right? So, employing the sort of westernized language and rhetoric of nationhood is to stake out a line and assert that uninterrupted territorial occupation, the ongoing political ordering of Indigenous people, the relationships to one another and to place, and the kin within that place that structure the laws that guide that Indigenous, nation, um, into the present. This is something that is a global phenomenon, but the particularities of these communities, nations, the articulation of that sovereignty is going to look different. And if you're going to look at Indigenous media, you have to get really contextual and specific in order to think about how are they articulating themselves and what is the role of media in that. Or, certainly people collaborate on projects. This is a real historical trend. And so seeking a tribal nationalism as the main lens for interpretation can get really complicated. And that's what I appreciated about looking at Indigenous media in Canada, was that this is really complicated. All the negotiations behind the screen and on screen, or that were happening off screen and that affected the content on screen, is an approach that I took. Really, my book looked at institutional analysis as a framework for reinterpreting Indigenous media, which is an approach that bridges the production context with what ends up on screen. Like, we can understand the negotiations off screen as something that gets inscribed on screen. And the reason I took that approach is because it was one way of addressing the question of, like, how did Indigenous media rise up across Canada in all of these institutions, all like provincial broadcasters, art galleries, museums, the National Film Agency, broadcasters, like, how did it start taking shape in all of these institutions sort of all at the same time? So to start to like sketch out a feel of the landscape, I was looking at how are Indigenous artists and advocates intervening in these established Canadian cultural and media institutions to create space for Indigenous production that would then, end up on screens in Canada, but largely, often for Indigenous audiences. So there's a form of engagement, I think, that's specific to Indigenous nationhood that we need to think about, in the sense that certainly in Canada, we have the Indian Act, which was established in 1876, sort of a law governing, like, historically a very, very oppressive federal law that intervened overwhelmingly in the lives of Indigenous people, setting up what are parameters in legislating Indigenous identity, setting up the reserve system, making Indigenous people wards of the state. But historically, the Indian Act has been the one piece of legislation that acknowledges that Indigenous people were here before settlers, before Canada was here. And it sketched out Canada's obligation to Indigenous people. So dismantling the Indian Act is a complex thing. But what it has meant for Indigenous people is like there are, along with treaties, they exist as evidence of a nation to nation relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. And Canada has an obligation to Indigenous peoples. So if there's a kind of nation to nation acknowledgement there, that means Canada is obligated to create within federal and provincial institutions space for Indigenous people. So, Indigenous people intervening in those institutions is a way of saying, no, you are obligated to include us here, and therefore our production here, our interventions are within these institutions, their production practices, their sort of genres, their forms of representation. And so I was interested in like, okay, how are Indigenous creatives negotiating those institutions? And then how do we see that end up on screen? And so Doug Cuthand is a great person to bring up. I mean, this is the approach I take to every, filmmaker or organization that forms the core of the chapters is how are they intervening in these processes? How can we read what they're doing as these really sophisticated critical negotiations of conventional media practice? So we see that, there's a chapter on the Aboriginal People's Television Network looking at how do Indigenous people take up reality television to represent Indigenous epistemologies, for instance, in the program that I love called Indians and Aliens, which is a really great reality TV program. But it became a vehicle for foregrounding and validating Indigenous understandings of off world phenomena that are unidentified aerial phenomena, I think is the term, is actually like, well, how do we understand this phenomena through Indigenous, like Cree lenses? Like, how do we understand their relationship to unidentified aerial phenomena? And they did it through reality TV. So it's like this really amazing kind of production and a really sophisticated like negotiation of reality TV exploitation and like mystery, paranormal sort of reality television to tell a different story about like how do we understand these as actually in continuity with Cree encounters with the unexplained that go back way before settler presence was here. Really, institutional analysis allowed me to get at that range and get away from essentializing, while at the same time really thinking about the negotiations that take place that end up on screen. And they're really sophisticated and really interesting and critical objects.
I was so interested in reading about Indians and aliens. I watched just this sort of YouTube, I think, sort of trailer for it. And it almost seems like it does this incredible feat by appealing to folks who might watch Ancient Aliens with almost the exact opposite takeaway at so many levels. And it made me think of Lisa Jackson, someone who shows up in your book, of course, her short animated um, film, The Visit, which is one of my favorites. And I
Yeah.
was wondering if that was sort of connected to that in any way.
Yeah, I would have to go back in to see. Like, I did an interview with Lisa that's actually coming out in a collection Joanna Hearn and I co-edited that will be coming out at University of Minnesota. And I did an interview with Lisa about the visit, and it's like a documentary audio that is then animated on screen about I believe it's a Cree communities, like, but more Western than Indians and Aliens is more Northern Cree in Quebec, what's now called Quebec. The family that she interviews that makes up the documentary audio, I'm not sure where they were actually located. I feel like they were in Alberta, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, I can't remember, but I really appreciated that section.
Indians and Aliens might have been a 2000. It was in the 2000s, but The Visit is 2009. So they're in and around the same time. It could be, like kind of identifying larger cultural patterns. Like you and I both, out of necessity, talk about Indigenous futurisms quite a lot. Like, my book isn't so focused on it, but I know you've written about Indigenous futurisms previously, and it's something I've like out of necessity had to talk about because later 2000s and well into 2010s is a real big era for Indigenous futurist work. And Lisa has done a lot of work with Indigenous futurisms in different platforms and genres. She did the VR project. Badabin First Light is this immersive, like a VR project that Lisa Jackson did, and it was released in 2018. So I feel like, we've seen a lot of Indigenous futurist work. Certainly from the early 2010s and onwards, just exploded. That is kind of symptomatic of a real surge. I want to say Billy Ray Belcourt talks about this almost like a surge of vitality, not just within the language of resurgence, as Indigenous people having the energetic, life giving resources to draw upon for resistance, for political engagement, like the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, crisis investigation and activism, Idle No More, which was 2013-14. So all of this is happening in 2010, these major mobilizations, this incredible like waterfall of Indigenous production that's kind of has this futurist orientation. And Belcourt talks about it as Indigenous people have always had joy, have always had these life-giving energies. But there is something more recently around this unbelievable surge of Indigenous like vitality and looking towards the future and imagining the future as a part of not just surviving, but being alive, like having the energetic resources to do this work that the state and settler colonialism has really sought to extinguish. It's been about wearing Indigenous people down, about like draining all those life-giving resources for its own benefit, obviously, which is dispossession and occupation. So there is something generationally that has shifted, I think. And I would also put something like revenge as a part of that energetic resource. Jeff Barnaby, the El Maya Tail Feathers, A Red Girl's Reasoning, these are revenge films, which I think point to similarly having the resources to be active in that way of really engaging and dismantling settler racism, colonialism, misogyny. I put that kind of looking towards the future and the energy and joy of being together and working together. That kind of representationally shows up as, a lot of science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction tropes and genres. And I also put revenge up there because to be able to take revenge on something means you have the energy to do so, right? So I'm seeing it as indexing something really important generationally. And I think like Lisa Jackson, of course, and she's such a pivotal figure in this. I don't know that she would describe herself as a futurist, but she certainly works in the genres along with, so many other Indigenous folks. Jeff Barnaby, who passed away, I think was it 20, just a few years ago. And it feels honestly more recent than that. It was like awful and way too young. But he also played a key role in developing this amazing body of work that really is about like, what is our future going to look like? How are we going to have a future beyond the apocalypse of settler colonialism? So what does post-apocalypse look like for us? And I think that's one of the questions, like you've brought that up as well, like this question of apocalypse.
Yeah, in the process, I appreciate your discussion of futurism. I couldn't agree more. It's taken hold, and this idea of apocalypse. I remember asking people if what they thought of that term, and I was expecting pushback because I didn't want to overstate things, so I wanted to be sure. But people said that's right. It works in terms of capturing the weight and gravity. And to the point about the future, and I think you're right, it's animated by a lot of things, one of which is apocalyptic understandings of where the world is going for Indigenous people and at some deeper levels as well. And one of the really interesting discussions I had with folks who had been in Balgo for a long time, and some folks who hadn't been there for a while, I was focusing a lot on the future. It was coming up in a lot of films. And when I would talk with people about the films and that theme, people's first reaction was, no, that doesn't come up in Balgo. People don't use that word. It doesn't have a meaning in Gugaja and local languages, which is true in one kind of narrow way of thinking about things, which gets back to the sort of limiting way of thinking about what cyclical time is or isn't. But people were using it all the time by the mid and early 2010s. And it's in a lot of governmental, very cynical sort of jobs programs type of work. They'll be called future workers and those kind of things. But it seemed to really be animated by a global discourse that I think ImagiNATIVE, had a big role in. A lot of this stuff is coming from Canada and Concordia University and Jason Lewis and Scawanati and a lot of really central folks like, Lisa Jackson, Leanne Simpson. And it's interesting to me that it seemed to be making its way through Indigenous activists and media circuits around the world to where in Balgo, it's something people talked about all the time. Um, and I think you're right. It was often discussed like in the future were very often directed directly to the prime minister. Like in the future, this is what we need. And it was often at the intersection of demands directly to the state, as well as plans and hopes and dreams for family amidst the backdrop that felt very apocalyptic. While I was there were these lists going around where they were going to defund most Aboriginal communities, which are not protected by treaties. So is something that can happen quickly. The referendum for a voice was shut down that would have acknowledged in the Constitution. There were a variety of things that happened, and there's treaty negotiations going on. But there is a sense that things are very dire, but people are also more connected than ever. And in media, there's more technological ability too that's just available around science fiction and VR and these kind of things. So I think it's all come together in a way where the future has a very political, almost punk rock, but very hopeful kind of constellation of meaning, from Standing Rock to a variety of protest movements, like in Sydney and Canberra. There's this, it seems to me, and thinking about what you're saying, there is something that it speaks to that's deeper, that's of the moment, and that is resonating around the world and echoing through media in technologies and specific topics. To that point, maybe sort of connecting two questions I was thinking about around ImagiNATIVE, and I think appropriately connecting it to virtual reality and futurist media. So, from my point of view, ImagiNATIVE was the film festival by far the most beloved throughout Australia by Indigenous filmmakers and media makers. Wonder if you can speak to that confluence of what ImagiNATIVE does, and you have such a deep understanding of where it comes from institutionally. Can you say a bit about why it's become such a vital global site on and off screen of media relations and that excitement around futurity and new technologies that also is not in competition with other genres?
Coming from in Canada, I sort of had this distorted idea about ImagiNATIVE. People are like, it's the biggest Indigenous film festival in the world. And I was like, that's really cool. And what started going when I was doing my PhD research. Cynthia Lickers-Sage was one of the founders and was certainly a part of this Canada-wide surge of Indigenous media production and advocacy in the 90s. She actually worked in association with the Aboriginal Film and Video Art Alliance. And she had gone to Toronto to kind of continue the work of media activism that had started with the Alliance. And, that's sort of one version of the story. But I definitely need to talk to her about her version of the story and sort of how that experience was for her. She went to Toronto and founded ImagiNATIVE. I think there are resources in Toronto that are very different than anywhere else in Canada for sure. And its proximity to New York and just being a kind of real urban center in Canada I think the resources were more amenable to supporting what ultimately became the size it is, which is really remarkable. Definitely my next research project is looking at film festivals, fan conventions, these sort of areas that are a part of Indigenous media cultures, like film cultures, production cultures. They're fed by things like festivals, by conventions that engage with thinking about these different media industries and what Indigenous presence in them could look like. But my perspective of festivals is that they're not sort of an end point to a film. They're not just exhibition sites. They are actually engines for the production of Indigenous media. In thinking about where do we get to see Indigenous media, it's not often on mainstream screens. Reservation Dogs, Rutherford Falls, Dark Winds, Taiko Waititi, like are kind of held up as like, yeah, of course, they made these unbelievable inroads production wise into mainstream film and television industries. And they're sort of what people recognize and see today. But when we think about Indigenous media worlds, like the realities of where do you get your work seen, it is often at festivals. So people are often trying to get their work done within the cycle for submitting to festivals to get their work seen. The festivals themselves provide panels, events. ImagiNATIVE has these micro meeting industry sessions where filmmakers, producers, creatives can meet with industry experts to talk over their ideas. Putting creatives in direct contact with industry people is a way of fostering production, right? It's trying to make those connections. They also have commissioned projects like the Embargo and Embargo 2 projects that Dennis Goulet, who worked with the festival, I think is artistic director for a while, and set up these kind of collaborative short film, what are they called? Incubators? I don't mean to use Silicon Valley words, but pretty much. I mean, that's how they worked. It was like to get Indigenous filmmakers working with one another to produce projects that would then be shown at the festival. They are fostering production. And this is something like my next project is around Indigenous production cultures. And what do I mean by that? And looking at film festivals, at like Indigipop X, at the major Indigenous fan convention, this is a way of talking about like what are these, what are thought of as parenthetical or peripheral activities that actually directly contribute to Indigenous production and critically reflect on it. So ImagiNATIVE is one of those places, and it has themes every year, sort of a kind of focus, and Indigenous futurist work has certainly been a focus there.
Yeah, I remember Bedabin was the title of two separate things. There was the VR, and then there was the one that I think maybe Leanne Simpson was involved with. It was so of the zeitgeist that that concept and particular term about the past and future meeting in the present was happening in multiple projects. And I really appreciate, that there's a VR space, there's games, there's cookies being printed with this laser kind of like futurist printer. In Australia, my experience is the same, that festivals are really the beating heart of the circulatory system of the media world. And there's so many layers of festivals. And to me, what's really special about ImagiNATIVE, just having attended and hearing what folks love about it, is it seems to achieve things that are quite separated in Australia. So, for example, Tjawa Tjawa, one of the films that I worked on for the longest period of time, its world premiere was in Balgo, in the community at the Art Center. There were often sort of Friday night drive-ins, which was a sort of primer white painted back of the basketball court. People would drive their Land Cruisers and sit on blankets and watch these documentaries, local films. Often that was the place that things were played, and people would talk about how they knew folks in the films, and it's a very relational place. And then when I talk about it in my book, sort of these expanding circuits and circles of circulation. So the sort of beating heart of the remote Indigenous media sector when I was there was the National Remote Indigenous Media Festival. And so this would be at a different community throughout, every year. It's changed a little since, but has a similar role. And they would have these Indigenous community television film festival screenings at night. And those were introduced by community members, and people would recollect things during the films. There were inside jokes, layers of meaning, a lot of talking throughout the films. But even much more importantly, off screen, there were countless workshops around skill building, developing, you know, values of production. People were camping, there were meals. I remember this one in the beach area, there was this crocodile that had to famously sort of be avoided. People were having an experience with each other that's renewing of relations and colleagues. And there's awards that are acknowledging people's work, but very much not about the reach and popularity, but much more about the process and relationships they fostered and the meaning of their work. And then there's strategy sessions of people navigating the complexities of funding and sharing those things. And so it felt so much more than the film festival, in a way, was the smallest part of it. People were excited to have their films in, but it had so many layers. But in Australia, so Tjawa Tjawa went to the Sydney International Film Festival, and that was much more, felt like a prestige international circuit component, which was important because it sort of legitimized the songlines on screens series that Tjawa Tjawa was a part of. And there was red carpet, wine and cheese kind of things. But ImagiNATIVE feels like it's doing some of both of those things that would happen at a community festival and at a very prestigious international festival. I sort of left before I got to see it in its fullest form, but the Wente Film Festival was assisted by ImagiNATIVE in Sydney to be developed as something that could be at that larger scale, but have those fundamental sort of values and way of thinking about the festival as relational and connective. I think that film festivals are the fundamental events and driving forces and engines, as you put it, of a lot of these sort of arenas. And I'm excited for that project that you're going to be engaging those types of events.
Yeah, I think it's something unique. It's good to hear about the work being done at festivals in Australia. Again, going to the ethics kind of perspective, the kind of idea of like, how do we support one another? How do we come together? How do we help provide support and direction and help a project come into being and, support the creatives in doing so? I think those are different ethical questions than a lot of mainstream festivals that are really oriented toward mainstream opportunities. Not to say that Indigenous film festivals also don't have an eye to other screens that have wider audiences. I mean, a lot of people are oriented that way, but the idea of like the way that communities form around and through these festivals are able to come together is something you've talked about. Kirsten Dowell has talked about. I think Amalia Cordova. There are people who've like looked at these sites of community and production communities that are really enabled by these festivals that are really important to understand. The reason I started going is like, one, I got to see productions I would never see otherwise. This might be your only chance in the year to see work you'll never know about otherwise. Being able to meet up with people I know and, see these filmmakers I know really well and maybe have known for years. But again, it's really facilitating like these ongoing relationships. And that's really important to me as well. I'm really glad like ImagiNATIVE has continued with this idea. They even shifted their screenings, like schedules, to help support Indigenous filmmakers to go to industry sessions so that the filmmakers could go to these sessions, but also go into the screenings. And so making those kinds of adjustments, like how do we support these creatives through the festival's operations, is again something that not a lot of festivals, I think, are going to be thinking about or thinking through in an ongoing ethical way. So that just really makes them unique in their orientation to the media world. It's something very important to acknowledge and understand.
Whenever I'm trying to think about how to convey the festival meaning, there's an annual conference for anthropologists called the AAAs, the American like SCMS for media studies, or NASA in Indigenous studies. And to me, it's kind of like that. There are panels and there are papers, but that's not the deeper, exciting thing about them. It's making those connections and laying the seeds for future projects and renewing relationships. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on the sort of tensions between a thriving Indigenous media world, which you talk about, especially in relation to the 90s. But Canada is often looked to, perhaps overly idealistically, as a real bastion for thriving Indigenous media. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the sort of tension between that thriving and state power. And you note on page 29 that on one level, there is this sort of dynamic where the state can kind of try to control through governmentality or other ways of thinking about it, a sort of controlled expression of resistance and representation. But of course, there's many layers to it, and I sort of landed in the particular Australian context around this visibility paradox way of thinking about it. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think of this tension between state sponsored media that they know on some level is going to be critical or promote sovereign movements that would undermine settler colonial power. And there's many people involved in these circuits who have probably different feelings, but anything in that realm, I'd love to hear how you've thought about that over time.
Yeah, that if this is analogous to the visibility paradox that you're talking about, it's sort of like, why would a state, a liberal democratic state, fund and support perspectives that are expressly meant to delegitimize and ultimately dismantle, be like it's critical of the state. So why would the state fund and support that? And the way I talked about it was through Foucault's concept of governmentality, and other people have articulated this in different ways. Indigenous scholars have thought about this in different ways, but it's fundamentally a technique. Foucault goes into it and talks about, the state shifts its identity. It's a way of managing discontent by giving a platform for it. So the state really manages discontent by accommodating it. I think we think about state power as often top down. That's not actually how power works, right? It works by appearing to accommodate dissenting perspectives without delegitimizing the state. So the state will shift its identity to accommodate critique of itself by, for instance, making a policy around multiculturalism, the idea that you can have a culturally variegated landscape in order to accommodate, to kind of shore up its own legitimacy by accommodating difference. And that's an old technique, right? Like it's done all over the place. We see reconciliation we can place within as a form of governmentality. It's a way of creating a kind of like formal transition point out of Indigenous discontent into a kind of, we see you, we recognize you. Yeah, let's transform our relationship, Indigenous state relations. Let's transform that. And so it inaugurates a transition between a presumably more colonial past into a more accommodationist presence. But, Glenn Coulthard and others have critiqued that. It's like, you can't artificially construct a transition point and like pretend as though colonization is something that happened, but we're in a different place now. It's like, no, you just switched your language up. Like, you changed your technique. You're still colonial, but you're just using a rhetoric and approach to quell dissent, to try to appear as though it's over. Like, we've moved past the, unpleasantness, the troubles, So this is, very common. And so it becomes a question, well, why are Indigenous people taking up, in a sense, almost seeming to accept the bargain? But that's not what's really happening, right? This goes back to Indigenous nationalism. It has always been about, like, the state has an obligation to Indigenous nations. So the state setting aside these programs and resources is actually is a part of its obligations. So Indigenous people aren't conceding and being absorbed into the body politic or into these institutions. They're going in and creating space to, for the articulation of Indigenous perspectives and to transform the way that institution operates in recognition of Indigenous right to those resources, to those programs, to participating in whatever way they see fit. So on the one hand, I think the self-defeating perspective is to see what Indigenous people are doing as giving into governmentality. If we shift our perspective to what Indigenous people are doing, we can see it as a form of negotiating what Audra Simpson, Mohawk anthropologist Audra Simpson, calls like the strangulation of colonial society. How do Indigenous people still stay together under this strangulating order? And she talks about how Mohawk people have maintained themselves as a political entity, despite it appearing as though a lot of Mohawk society looks like it mirrors or mimics the colonial state apparatuses. She's like, well, they did it to throw up a veil, to say, we don't need you to come in here and manage in our everyday lives. Look, we have passports, we have a band office, we have a council, we're governing ourselves. And look, we have what you have. So stay out of our business. It's a very sophisticated way of navigating the strangulating constraints of colonization to stay together as Mohawk people, and that's what Native nationalists do. It looks one way when you're looking at it from the colonizer's perspective. It looks like assimilation, but that's not what Native people are doing. They're using every apparatus, every technique within their control to hold together as people. So this is, we could expand into talking about, why Indigenous people take up capitalism, like say casino capitalism, like we see in Rutherford Falls. Like, why? Isn't that a watering down? It's like, no, it's not at all. They're using capital to facilitate different principles of being together, of getting back what was stolen. And this is articulated in Rutherford Falls, which is an amazing series, and I could talk about for another hour. But I think we really need to shift perspective. Like, the moment you think Indigenous people are being assimilated, you need to really reorient your perspective and think about, how are Indigenous people engaging with these apparatuses to shore up and protect and operate within principles that have never been extinguished, of holding together as political entities like nations.
Absolutely. I really appreciate all that nuance. And I don't want to forget to advertise the book that you all have coming out soon. The one thing I would add is I really appreciated your use of Barry Barkley, um, his idea of the view from the ship and the view from the shore. And one of the things that I was thinking about in relation to this is that amidst all the things you're saying, I think there is a sense from settler states such as Australia and Canada, that the project of settler colonization is so overwhelmingly successful and on some levels complete, that there's a sort of dismissal of media as having the impact that they actually do. And people are able to wield that misunderstanding in ways that power movements, from Standing Rock to the referendum in Australia and many other places. But I thought you put that really well in those subtle dynamics and the sort of cynical position people could fall in around these topics but shouldn't. But I would love to, for the title or maybe a short description of your book to be part of this production, if you have that on hand.
Sure. Yeah, I will say, by wrapping us up, that the by plugging the book, the coming out University of Minnesota Press, I co-edited with Joanna Hearn. That is called By Their Work: Indigenous Women's Digital Media in North America. It is a big one in the sense that it is actually pretty voluminous, and it really looks at the history of Indigenous women and women identified and queer folks, their contributions to shaping the Indigenous digital landscape historically, and the people who are working today. So we're really excited about it, and looking forward to seeing it released. And thank you for bringing that up, Willie, and for this conversation today. We could keep going, but I think we covered a lot of good ground today.
It was a real pleasure.
This has been a University of Minnesota Press production. Willie Lempert's book Dreaming Down the Track, Awakenings in Aboriginal Cinema, and Carmen Cray's books Producing Sovereignty, The Rise of Indigenous Media in Canada, and more recently, By Their Work, Indigenous Women's Digital Media in North America, co-edited by Joanna Hearn, are all available from University of Minnesota Press. Thank you for listening.